We're talking about a fascinating new documentary from CBS Reports exploring the bison's return from the brink of extinction. 100 years ago, the iconic bison were overhunted and nearly wiped out as a result.
10 years ago, scientists in Mexico made a decision many called reckless. They released a small herd of bison into a barren desert. No grass, no streams, no human help. Locals shook their heads. How could massive grazers survive where even weeds struggled? The odds looked impossible. Then, a decade later, the same land told a very different story. What appeared at first to be a doomed experiment had turned into something no one predicted. The question is, what really happened in those 10 years? From millions to almost none. Long before highways, cities, and fences carved up North America, vast herds of bison thundered across the plains. By some estimates, more than 60 million once roamed from Canada to northern Mexico. They were more than animals, they were moving landscapes. Their hooves stirred the soil, their grazing shaped plant growth, and their migrations sustained predators, scavengers, and people. For centuries, indigenous communities lived in balance with them. The bison provided food, hides for clothing, shelter, and bones that became tools. Every part of the animal had a purpose, and nothing was wasted. The relationship was not one of domination but of reciprocity. Indigenous cultures understood that their survival was tied to the bison's survival. But the arrival of European settlers changed everything. In the 18th and 19th centuries, hunting shifted from subsistence to mass slaughter. Railroads expanded westward, offering easy transport for hides and meat. Hunters began slaying bison not for survival but for profit, and sometimes for sport. Shooting from train windows became a grim pastime, and entire carcasses were left to rot on the prairie while only hides or tongues were taken for sale. What had once been a balance between human need and natural abundance collapsed under the weight of greed and industrial-scale hunting. By the 1870s, bison hides had become a booming commodity. Factories churned out leather belts to drive machines during the Industrial Revolution, and tongues were shipped to restaurants as a delicacy. The U.S. military quietly encouraged the slaughter, knowing that if the bison disappeared, the indigenous nations of the plains would lose their main source of food and power. It was a deliberate strategy of starvation and displacement. Within 2 decades, the great herds had been decimated. The stats speak a tale of horror. From tens of millions at the start of the 1800s, the population fell to merely a few million by 1870. By 1889, fewer than 550 wild bison were remaining in the entire United States. Mexico's bison were hunted entirely out. Small pockets persisted in the most remote regions of the United States and Canada, but the bison disappeared completely in Mexico. At the end of the 19th century, the species disappeared from Mexico, eradicated from the soil where it once thrived. It is more than mere animals that are lost, it is one of the keystone species draining the board. The grasslands have started unraveling without buffalo. Prairie dogs, which depend on the loose soil of bison-trodden plains, have lost ground and numbers. They are followed by the predators, namely wolves and ferrets. Again, large clumps of brittle, dense vegetation now die back under overgrazing by cattle in place of the more dynamic grazing of wild bison. Rivers and streams have built their own natural banks. There came, without hooves to churning and no herds to fertilizing, the land hardened and dried. The loss was an ecological and spiritual one for the indigenous peoples, as the sacred connection they shared with the bison was severed in an instant. As the herds began disappearing, the songs and stories, and ceremonies connecting the animal's life cycle to human life held no more meaning. Communities that had depended on the bison for their sustenance and trade were thrown into dependence on government rations or forced removal to reservations. What once had been a vibrant symbol of abundance turned into nothing but a symbol of extermination. By the 20th century, the buffalo, as the bison was then popularly called, existed only in memories, paintings, and a few small conservation herds. It could not be thought that they would have been once mighty enough to define entire landscapes and that there could ever be some hope for their return to northern Mexico. For decades, the sad story of the bison was told as a tragedy lacking any hope, A species nearly exterminated, a land stripped off, and a culture devastated. Of course, nature has a way of surprising us. Through great odds against them, conservationists in America achieved success in the form of protection and breeding of small herds. By the early 2000s, these herds had grown large enough to be considered in projects for reintroduction. And now in Mexico, where the bison had disappeared years beyond a century, scientists were raising a daring question. Will the animal that had previously defined the grasslands also restore them? But before we understand the miracle of recovery, we need to see just how lifeless the land had become in the bison's absence, a desert of thorns and silence where life itself seemed impossible. Desert of thorns and silence. When the last bison vanished from Mexico, the change in the land was not immediate, but it was relentless. For centuries, the herds had acted like gardeners of the grasslands, loosening soil, spreading seeds, and fertilizing plants. Without them, the balance broke. At first, people simply noticed less movement on the horizon. No thunder of hooves. No dust clouds stirred by grazing herds. But over time, the absence rippled through the ecosystem like a slow, creeping drought. Northern Mexico's plains, once wide and green, began to harden. Without hooves cracking the surface, the soil compacted into a crust. This crust acted like concrete, blocking rain from soaking in. Water ran off, leaving streams that once carried steady flows dwindling to trickles. Grass struggled to regrow. Where a sea of prairie once waved, thorn bushes and spiny desert plants crept in. The land, once alive with birdsong and insects, fell silent, broken only by the hiss of wind through dry branches. Farmers noticed too. Cattle replaced bison, but cows grazed differently. Instead of moving restlessly across the plains, they lingered in one place, stripping it bare before moving on. What remained was not a healthy pasture but dirt, trampled and eroded. When the rains came, the topsoil washed away, leaving rocks and dust. Generations of soil, built by roots and animal cycles, simply vanished. This collapse moved through the creatures associated with bison-shaped landscapes. Once busy in their occupation as the engineers of the plains, prairie dogs faded away as the hardened soil became impossible to burrow. Without them, the soil lost one of its master tillers. No aerated soil, no mixing of nutrients, no tunnels trapping rainwater underground. Consequently, the predators that used the prairie dog as their prey, black-footed ferrets and the burrowing owl, also vanished as a consequence. The silence had deepened. Hundreds of species that were once interlocked like gears in a machine, but do not now run. Insects that once thrived in bison-grazed fields declined. Pollinators became noticeably sparse. The wind itself seemed to change, bearing more dust and less scent of life. A once thriving system crashed into a broken loop, a desert of thorns and silence. The impact on communities was felt across daily lives. Soil crust meant less yield from fields, and grazing lands were no longer able to support livestock. Farmers drove herds farther away or lost interest altogether. Wells dried faster since the land quickly lost its capacity to absorb rain. Whatever water was there had silt in it, choking the streams and reducing their quality for potable water for both humans and wildlife. The damage was not ecological, it was economic and social. The scientists would call it desertification, a process through which fertile land further degrades until it can no longer sustain life. For the locals, though, it was simpler. The land was dying. They could call to mind their grandparents' stories of endless bison herds, rivers with fuller flows, grass taller than a horse's belly, skies full of hawks and eagles. By the 20th century, they began to feel like classic myths. The land in front of them was brittle, prickly, and empty. A bold idea was born here. If one disappearance was responsible for the collapse, would bringing the species back mean renewal? It sounded impossible. The land looked too dead to heal. But a group of scientists thought otherwise. Nature does not forget, they said, it only waits. They put this to the test in 2009. That year, a handful of bison stepped onto Mexican soil for the first time in more than a century. Most believed they wouldn't last a season. What happened next shocked everyone. The crazy release of 2009. By the late 2000s, much of northern Mexico's grasslands looked more like wastelands. The soil was hard, rivers were weak, and wildlife was nearly gone. For decades, experts tried to fix the problem with human tools, planting grasses, digging irrigation channels, even spraying seeds from planes. None of it lasted. The land seemed beyond saving. But a small group of conservationists thought differently. They believed healing would come not from machines, but from the return of the very animals that once kept the ecosystem alive, the bison. In 2009, after years of planning and debate, 23 American bison were transported from the mountains of the United States to a barren stretch of Chihuahua, Mexico. To outsiders, it looked absurd. Why release such massive animals into an area with barely enough food or water for goats? Critics mocked the project as doomed. Ranchers feared the bison would compete with cattle or destroy fences. Even government officials hesitated, worried resources would be wasted on animals that had vanished from the country more than a century earlier. But the scientists had a different vision. They chose not to interfere once the bison were released. No supplemental feeding, no special watering stations, no protective enclosures. The herd would roam freely, just as their ancestors had. The logic was bold. If bison couldn't survive on their own, the ecosystem was too far gone. But if they could, they might trigger natural processes no human plan had ever managed to replicate. The release itself was thrilling and tense. As the heavy transport trucks arrived and gates swung open, the animals hesitated at first, sniffing the dry air. Then, one by one, they stepped out, huge shoulders swaying, shaggy coats brushing thorny shrubs. Dust rose beneath their hooves as they began to move, not in panic, but with steady strides. For the first time in more than a century, wild bison roamed Mexico again. After wandering through the desert grasslands for weeks, the animals scrounged around for what little forage and water they could find. Observers feared starvation. Then came the unforeseen. The bison began to adapt. They dug into solid ground to find hidden moisture. They grazed selectively, weeding plants in a way that encouraged regeneration. They would not stay put for long. They kept moving. And the land began to respond. Soil that had long been locked compact started loosening from the stamping of their hooves. When the first rains came, instead of running off, water absorbed in. Green shoots appeared in places that had lain bare for years. Locals who had written off the project began to notice the difference. Birds returned, insects started buzzing, and the sight of calves in the herd brought hope. In less than a year, the bison were not only surviving but flourishing. The desert was coming back to life against all odds. With equal measure to the ecological one was the symbolic weight. For the indigenous peoples of northern Mexico, the bison's return held deep significance. It meant reviving an animal, and with it, a history tied to the land from which they had been cut off many generations ago. The elders would tell stories of their ancestors who had lived among the great herds, and now these stories could be seen and not just remembered. Skeptics, however, lingered. They were saying the early recovery was a fluke, that the animals would ravage lands and perish. But the herd increased in number steadily with each passing year, and the land turned greener. By 2018, less than 20 years since their release, their numbers rose from the original 23 to over 200. What had been a bet was now indisputable evidence for how bison could breathe life into dead land. But how could a few dozen animals succeed where years of human effort had failed? The secret lay not in what people did for the land, but in what the bison did with every hoof print, every step, and every roll in the dust.